Hey there, I'm Mr. Terry. I'm a high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video. All right, I can tell you guys liked part 1 of the Vietnam War by Things I Care About. And if I said you guys were watching that video, I would definitely check out part 2. If you haven't seen the part 1, I will link that down below. But make sure you support Things I Care About. The channel is a kind of newer growing one. They got 30,000 subs right now. And this part 2 could really use your love in getting that view. So again, go to the link down below. All right, let's do it. So where we left off is the United States has really taken over from the French, basically taking the major role of the Vietnam War. In a lot of ways, the U.S. already was. One of the interesting stats, and they talked about it in the first part of the video, was that the U.S. was supplying like 80% of the war materials, you know, bombs, weapons, stuff like that, for the French. And with the French leaving, the United States is going to come in and start going full send, not an advisory mission anymore like it was supposed to be. We also saw that interesting kind of, whether it was a false flag operation or not, the Gulf of Tonkin incident that's going to bring, give executive powers to the President of the United States so that troops can start to hit the ground. So it's full send time. So, all right, here we go.
The North realized that fighting the Americans head-on would not work, so they decided to switch strategy.
It's true.
It is time.
You want to fight toe-to-toe. Yeah, don't want to fight toe-to-toe with the U.S.
Rolling Thunder was proving to be a massive failure. With help from their good pals China and the Soviet Union, the North Vietnamese Air Force was growing rapidly, and with their new and powerful network of anti-air defenses and radar systems, the North shot down hundreds of US planes.
I mean, the operation was incredibly destructive. The amount of bombs and stuff that were dropped, it's like putting World War II to shame, you know, and then the horrible things like the napalm, and then you're going to get Agent Orange and all these things. But it's just that it did not destroy really the resolve of the North. They're able to kind of recover and that kind of thing. I think that's where you would see it more as an abject failure. They weren't able just to bomb the North into submission.
During this time, movement of troops from north to south tripled. So again, the US decided to change focus.
Nixon time.
Rolling Thunder now targeted the North's petroleum and oil capacity. They succeeded in destroying over 70% of it, and
every
the
war is a war of
hit the remaining
resources.
fuel in populated areas they knew the US would not bomb. But despite the evident success of the operation, this phase of Rolling Thunder only made the North Vietnamese more determined to keep fighting and strengthened the Hanoi government.
That's in a lot of ways how
On paper,
not effective.
The anti-communist forces vastly outnumbered the communists, almost 400,000 Americans, nearly 750,000 armed troops, and some 50,000 from other allied nations, fighting against an estimated 300,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army members who were hiding in the south.
We know this isn't a war of attrition. It's not necessarily going to be the deciding factor. It's a lot more than that.
But despite their numbers, the Allies were trying to find and destroy a largely invisible enemy. And while the Americans controlled key cities and strongholds, vast areas of South Vietnam were effectively hostile territory.
Yep.
Watch out!
There was no
There's a
safe
Viet Cong fighter
homeland.
hiding here. Can you spot him? Of course you can't, because he was hiding in a spider hole, the most extensively used defensive structure. Spider holes were dug directly down into the earth and covered with vegetation for camouflage, making them almost impossible to spot in the jungle. When approached by the enemy, the hiding soldier waited as long as possible before revealing himself. This created surprise and confusion and meant that artillery, grenade launchers, and air support would be at risk of friendly fire.
Yeah.
If this was not hard enough to deal with,
You see how that the big technology and the big bombs and stuff like that is not what it's not going to work. I mean, I don't say it's not going to work, but it's just not as effective, right? You know, where the United States is going to be good at is fighting toe-to-toe, open battlefields and stuff like this. But this kind of warfare, the U.S. did not know how to deal with, you know?
a Viet Cong or North Vietnamese army position would have carefully planned routes of withdrawal. So, if attacked, some troops engaged the Allied forces, while the bulk of the unit retreated to safety. The Viet Cong would attack mostly in ambushes. They dug foxholes, trenches, and other defensive positions across a roadway and carefully concealed them. They attacked just before dark, dealt as much damage as possible, and withdrew under the cover of night before the enemy had time to recover. A perfect example of the resourcefulness of the Viet Cong was a simple trap called the punji stick.
Ooh,
It was just a sharpened wooden stick hidden in a hole in the ground.
this thing.
Sometimes it was large enough for a soldier to fall and impale himself.
Yeah, it was
but
sharp.
even a single stake in a small hidden hole could be enough to pierce a soldier's foot and delay his entire unit.
Ugh.
But the deadliest and most horrifying traps were the infamous Viet Cong booby traps. Bamboo whips, toe popper mines, hollowed out trees filled with explosives, snare traps, all kinds of tripwires. Many young Americans lost limbs and even their lives to these horrifying traps. About 20% of American casualties in the entire war were inflicted by either mines or booby traps.
Wow, what was the
Casualties
stat?
in the entire war were inflicted by
What was that
about
stat?
20% of American casualties in
20%.
the entire war were inflicted by either mines or booby traps.
And we think of it essentially as like the guerrilla warfare. 20% of a major American army by rudimentary traps, right? Here in the 1960s, right? Stuff you probably would have seen centuries before that. Shoot, millennia before that.
Thousands
Except
of
the mines.
unlucky civilians would also share this horrible fate. To counter these tactics, the US relied heavily on its artillery and carpet-bombed enemy positions before engaging them in battle. They also used napalm, a viscous gel that sticks to targets and burns slower and hotter than gasoline. Napalm was devastatingly effective against entrenched enemies.
So yeah, it's gonna be great. It's about destroying the foliage there, all the jungle. So yeah, gelified, it's almost like a gelified gasoline. Can't be put out with water either. In fact, water can make it worse.
Effective at killing the Viet Cong, these weapons were also excellent at accidentally killing civilians.
It did a lot of that. Yeah.
Another major offender was the American artillery practice of harassment and interdiction. This meant firing explosive rounds at random intervals, often blindly and during the night, onto suspected enemy routes of movements like roads and rivers. Most of the time, nothing was hit. On rare occasions, an unlucky Viet Cong or North Vietnamese Army unit would get shelled.
Low
But
efficiency
what would
though.
happen most often was this. Ah, what a lovely day. It's surely been rough these past couple of decades with all these wars and all, but at least I got my health and a beautiful wife at home. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese...
So, you know, what happened is the longer this war went on, from the perspective of the Americans, the lines were blurred more and more about who was an enemy, who was a friendly, who was a neutral. It became more and more like that because, like you said, it was possible to tell. You interact with these people in the daytime, and then at night, it's a very different story. There's different things happening, and it kind of, yeah, it blurred the lines to the point where, like, there were no lines anymore between friend, foe, neutral, non-neutral, you know what I mean? And that just became more devastating, more deadly, more and more civilians being killed. And then, you know, anyway.
The army often sheltered near villages, hoping to avoid American fire, knowing that if they did attack them, the civilian casualties would turn more people against the Americans.
And it did.
Stupid vegetation.
Made the Americans
if
look
there wasn't
bad
so much jungle,
in the eyes of
we could
fence
easily
sitters.
win this war. Well, they cannot hide in the jungle if there is no jungle.
That was literally yeah,
Let's just get rid of the entire jungle.
that's what it was.
That is genius! The Americans developed chemical herbicides to counteract the communist use of vegetation as cover. The US Air Force destroyed around 20% of the jungles of South Vietnam and between 20 and 50% of the mangrove forests in one of the largest single incidents of ecocide. The Viet Cong used an extensive network of underground tunnels to avoid detection. The largest one was the Cu Chi Tunnel Complex, which at its peak had over 200 miles of tunnels.
Let's just look at this for a second. Like, look at it. It's like it's an underground base. It's totally underground base with tunnels you can barely crawl through. You have fake tunnels with like traps and stuff like that. You got bike generator down there to get like some light. Amazing how they're able to create these networks like that.
In Operation Cedar Falls in January 1967, the Allies sent 30,000 troops to find and destroy the tunnels in an area called the Iron Triangle.
The only way to
and
do it
Army
was send
forces
someone down there.
bulldozed all vegetation from the region and used chemicals to contaminate the rice paddies. The civilian population of nearly 6,000 was forcibly relocated to other areas, and their homes and villages were burned down.
That'll create famine.
The Viet Cong did not defend the tunnels and simply evaded the attack. This operation was a clear example of the inherent flaws in the American strategy. From a tactical standpoint, the operation was a success. They obliterated the tunnels and forced the Viet Cong out. Yet the Viet Cong was operating in the region again within just 10 days, so in the end, nothing was accomplished.
I was talking about this in the first video, that one of those agents that they use to kill off vegetation, Agent Orange, was something that had long-term devastation because it had properties in it that led to like mutations, cancer, right? Like people that were exposed to it, or that included a lot of Americans. So just story of someone I know whose father ended up dying from cancer, and they think it was because he was a pilot, helicopter pilot, and because he was exposed to, he went on those missions that sprayed that stuff, and probably what gave him cancer. But yeah, birth defects and stuff like that for the Vietnamese population, it was really bad. Kind of similar, think about it as like, some of those birth defects and stuff that happened after like the atomic bombs in Japan.
Oh, except that they all hate the US now. The war at this point was incredibly costly for both sides. Almost 20,000 Americans had already died, and the American public saw little point in the war. Protests broke out across the US, defying the draft and the continuation of the war. President Johnson reassured the public that the war was almost over.
This was always being said. Now, the big difference was this is the television era. This is the first war in American history where literally you got nightly video feeds, right? By this time, TV's in every house in America. So you're getting these images of these horrific things happening, to the Americans as well as the Vietnamese. And it doesn't look like it's going very well, at least from that. But then you would hear this message from the government saying, no, the war is actually going well. And it created a lot of distrust. And so it messed with, what people actually thought of the war. And the war became more and more unpopular. And in a democratic society where people have a lot of influence and Congress and all that, it's very difficult to win wars against public opinion.
By the end of 1967, Le Duan believed that the South Vietnamese were eager to expel the Americans and their puppet government. So he and his allies conceived of a major offensive across the South, believing that the people there would rise up and topple the Saigon government. The North Vietnam Army gathered...
Was he got a Twitch channel? It's a little thing. Things I care about, Nick. Okay,
people
cool.
there would rise up and topple the Saigon government. The North Vietnam Army gathered along the demilitarized zone, drawing American troops away from populated areas, while guerrillas moved clandestinely into every province and district capital, even into Saigon. There, they would wait for the signal to strike.
The Ho Chi Minh Trail, which just goes outside.
The US fought fiercely to prevent the movement of enemy troops. One of the bloodiest battles occurred on Hill 875, which Americans attempted to secure. With 360 killed and almost 2,000 wounded, the battle was incredibly costly for Americans. It also saw the worst case of friendly fire in the Vietnam War, when an American plane mistakenly dropped a bomb right into the American-controlled perimeter, killing at least 42 Americans.
Friendly fire is a real thing.
A US victory, but Hill 875 had little strategic significance beyond having taken it from the North Vietnamese. So the Americans didn't gain anything, and the hill was back under enemy control within a week.
Ugh.
Although the US had noticed the troop movements and tried to stop them, the scale of the offensive was a tremendous surprise. This was an intelligence failure comparable to the attack on Pearl Harbor.
Oh.
The offensive began on January 30, just before the festivity of Tet. Around 84,000 soldiers just before the festivity of Tet. Around 84,000 soldiers attacked over 100 targets across the South. They struck American bases all over the country, including the US Army headquarters at Long Binh Post and the South Vietnam headquarters at Tan Son Nhut.
This was, by the way, he's starting to talk about the Tet Offensive, this massive offensive over like every American position out there in the cities. This was one of those specific events where where people, specifically like Americans, were seeing how the message of how the war is going well was not there. Was it Walter Cronkite or whatever, basically America's newsman or something? I think it was famous as he was airing the stuff from that day, like on air, was like, I thought we were winning the war. I thought we were winning. And they saw the Tet Offensive just laying, just so destructive. It's American allied positions. This specifically was like, okay, like people I think in America were if you were kind of on the fence about, you know, is it going well, as it wasn't, for a lot of people, this was like, okay, this war is actually going terribly.
North Vietnam soldiers surged across the 17th parallel, but failed to take the American base at Khe Sanh. For the first time, the Americans and South Vietnamese could see who they were fighting against. Despite the ambush, they were now fighting on their terms. The northern armies attacked the former imperial capital of Hue, knowing that people there disliked the government and hoped for a major uprising. But it didn't happen. Still, the city's defenders were overwhelmed, and the city fell quickly. The Viet Cong, attempting to consolidate power, went after American sympathizers and anyone they saw as opposition. Historians believe that between 2,000 and 8,000 people were killed. The Allies immediately began an assault to retake the city.
If I remember right, I think the Vietnamese deaths were a lot more, but we're still able to take those positions, if I remember right. But that's been a common thing in a lot of these battles, if you notice, where, you know, more of the Viet Cong or whatever would die. But again, it's not just a war of attrition, right?
By March, they kicked the communists out, and the fighting left the city in ruin. About half the buildings were destroyed, and 3/4 of its population was left homeless. The attack on Saigon went even worse, and the North failed to take any of their military targets. By any measure, the Tet Offensive was a staggering defeat for the North. It did not incite the widespread support it was supposed to, and brutal civilian massacres such as Hue worsened their reputation, turning many into anti-communists. The Viet Cong suffered terrible losses and would never fully recover. But the Tet Offensive did accomplish one thing. It showed the world that the North was capable of launching large-scale surprise attacks. And
that's what I'm saying. I thought it was interesting how he was setting that up, because, I mean, they do recover. They will recover. But again, from the strategic standpoint and like deaths and stuff like that, but it did definitely showed vulnerability. That's right.
Right after President Johnson had promised that the war was almost over, the American public had seen live on TV the largest assault of the war. Trust in the government was further shattered, and the American public now demanded de-escalation and for the war to be turned over to South Vietnam.
That was going to be the
new
process.
On March 16th, American forces entered the village of My Lai. Believing it to be friendly to the Viet Cong, they rounded up the villagers around a ditch and executed them without mercy. They killed the elderly and children. Women and girls were abused before being shot in the head. American forces murdered 500 villagers and did their best to cover it up. It wasn't until 1969 that an investigation by journalist Seymour Hersh.
I remember when I was teaching U.S. history classes. I teach all world history classes now, but I was teaching U.S. history classes, and knowing the specific numbers and all that stuff, I trying to refresh.
In 1969, that an investigation by journalist Seymour Hersh uncovered the truth. Only Lieutenant William Calley was convicted of 22 counts of murder, but after appealing, he only served 3 years of house arrest.
Yeah, you hear that? A lot of people were involved in it, and really it comes down to, like, you know, who gives the orders, right? That's who you punish, right? And if I remember right, some of the quotes and stuff that Calley was saying, you know, it was like in the testimonies from, I guess, soldiers or something, about just it was deliberately not meant to try to differentiate friend or neutral from foe. Like, it was just like indiscriminate, right? The just slaughter of these hundreds of Vietnamese people. Again, when that broke out, that was huge. That's where people were starting to turn on. Americans were actually not even necessarily turning on the reason why United States is in this war, but also turning on soldiers, right? Soldiers coming home and stuff like that. A lot of them were met with some horrible accusations and stuff, that they were, you know, baby killers and all that kind of stuff, because of stories like this.
Arthur Sylvester, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs, was the man most responsible for giving, controlling, and managing the war news from Vietnam. You have a patriotic duty to disseminate only information that makes the US look good. Surely, Arthur, you don't expect the American press to be handmaidens of the government. That is exactly what I expect. Look, if you think
Not in the
any
era of the
American
free
official
press.
is going to tell you the truth, you are stupid. Did you hear that? Stupid. After the failure of the
Actual
Tet Offensive, South Vietnam had become much stronger. They even managed to democratically elect a leader for the first time and wrote a constitution. In 1968, just before the US presidential elections, all sides were finally going to meet for the first time for peace talks. But South Vietnam withdrew unexpectedly. The Nixon campaign had contacted South Vietnam in secret and promised that they would be able to offer the Saigon government a better deal than the opposing candidate Hubert Humphrey if the South stayed away from the peace talks. President Johnson found out about this thanks to the CIA's illegal wiretapping of the US Embassy. Richard Nixon contacted a foreign government to sabotage peace talks, thus extending the war and leading to the deaths of thousands of additional Americans. All this for his own political gain, in an act that might even be considered treason. President Johnson didn't want to reveal how he had gotten this information, so he decided to say nothing. The peace talks failed, and the war continued.
Oh.
Nixon
Almost there. It's like this war been going on with the I mean, since the 50s. It's gone through like Truman and Eisenhower and JFK and LBJ, and it's going to be going through Nixon and stuff. It's like, you know, on the first video I was telling you how the Vietnam War was largely nonpartisan, right? Because in that streak of presidents, you had Republicans, you had Democrats. It was just like, and now it's becoming the partisan issue isn't even going to be between the political parties. Eventually, it's going to be between really like the government versus the people now, as you see from these protesters outside the Oval Office here.
President understood that the Americans were tired of their involvement in the war. Despite their losses, North Vietnam was still
I wonder if he's going to bring in Kissinger at all. You know, he died recently, and his role in all this, Henry Kissinger,
committed to the war as ever. And while the South was stronger than before, it was not strong enough to survive without the United States.
Right.
So Nixon had a dilemma. He needed to get out of Vietnam, but not lose it. The solution: Vietnamization. Build up South Vietnam so that they could stand their ground against the North. The first step would be to go after the Viet Cong support in the countryside. The problem with invading a country and fighting a native population is that you cannot distinguish friend from foe.
Right.
Every single person is a potential informer, bomb thrower, or assassin. The Allies decided to consider everyone until proven innocent to be part of the Viet Cong infrastructure of support. They implemented the Phoenix program, a coordinated effort to wipe out this infrastructure. South Vietnamese citizens were rounded up and jailed by the thousands without trial. Many were killed on the spot or tortured for information. According to CIA,
this is how you know, for every, you know, you're torturing him with watching what the heck's that stupid movie called? The vampire movie? Twilight. Tortured him with watching Twilight. But this is how you also, you know, when you do this indiscriminate stuff, that's also how you convert people away from your cause into an opposing cause, is by doing this. So, yeah.
Members, no one ever survived the torture. Official death tolls are hard to estimate. The CIA claims the dead to be around 20,000, while South Vietnam claimed that it was closer to 40,000. It is impossible to know the exact number or how many of these people were actual members of the Viet Cong.
We'll never know.
In 1971, the director of Phoenix, William Colby, was asked by a congressman, "Are you certain that we know a member of the VCI from a loyal member of the South Vietnam citizenry?" "No, Mr. Congressman, I am not." But despite its brutality, the Phoenix program was a success, and the Viet Cong was severely weakened. The South still had a large legitimacy issue. The government had strong support from the country's elite, but barely any from the rural Vietnamese. So on March 26, 1970, President-elect Thieu of South Vietnam signed a bill that redistributed 2.5 million acres of land free of charge to more than 500,000 farm families, winning him massive support.
There you go. I mean, that's just going back to the basic beliefs that they were hoping for. You know, the Vietnamese, going back to before the colonial era, where things were just ruled by aristocrats, whether that was French, Japanese, or just yeah, again, just wealthy aristocrats, that redistribution of land. You know, that was part of the platform the whole time to try to raise these people out of their condition. So it's like, all right, it should be over, right? All right, now the South is going to be loved, their leadership's going to be loved, and war's over, right?
Next, the Allies went after the Viet Cong supply lines in Laos and Cambodia. Knowing that the US public would never agree to the expansion of the war, the invasion was kept a secret.
War got expanded.
30,000 Americans and 50,000 South Vietnam soldiers marched into Cambodia. The massive army broke through the communist lines, killing 10,000 and capturing thousands more, dealing a staggering blow to communist logistics. The attack was accompanied by brutal bombing campaigns over Cambodia that
another
would continue
country
way after the invasion ended, causing horrifying amounts of civilian casualties. There is no other way to describe what was done to Cambodia, other than to say that it was bombed back to the Stone Age.
Yeah.
The US indiscriminately bombed civilians and combatants alike without mercy. Henry Kissinger, then National Security Advisor, personally picked almost every target. As Anthony Bourdain wrote in his memoirs, once you have been to Cambodia, you will never stop wanting to beat Henry Kissinger to death with your bare hands.
They're both dead now, Anthony Bourdain, yeah, with that, because he traveled so much. We'll see if he gets into it, but this completely destabilized the nation of Cambodia, leading to the Khmer Rouge, which is a brutal dictatorship led by Pol Pot, if you heard of him. He ends up pretty much, it leads to the death, once Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge come into power, to 25% of all Cambodians died. And basically a genocide power struggle as a result of this destabilization by extending the war into Cambodia.
Cambodia remains, to this day, the most bombed country in history. Yes, even more than the bombings of Japan or Germany during World War II.
I didn't know it was the most.
The US bombings massacred several hundreds of thousands of people, mostly civilians. The real number will likely never be known, but scholars have estimated between 150 and 800,000 victims. As a consequence of the American bombings, Cambodians flocked towards an extremist group called the Khmer Rouge, who would eventually grow enough to take power and carry out a horrifying genocide.
25% of the Cambodian population, millions.
In 1971, the Allies sent a force of 15,000 into Laos.
And I got Laos
but
too.
Unlike the one in Cambodia, this incursion was a disaster. Only half of the original force of 15,000 made it back home, with 1,400 American casualties. So they decided to just bomb the fuck out of Laos too. Hey, we saw what you did. That's impossible. I always cover my webcam. How dare you? Wait, what? What? What are you talking about? What are you talking about? You just invaded Cambodia when you said you would stop the war. Oh, thank God. Yeah, I did that. The American public found out about the incursion and they were furious. 150,000 people gathered in San Francisco, another 100,000 in Washington. Protests occurred at nearly 900 colleges and universities, involving more than 1 million students. The American government cracked down on the protests, killing 4 students. With so much opposition to the war,
Massacre.
the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was repealed in June. The number of US soldiers in Vietnam went from 550,000 to 140,000 by the end of 1971.
Because remember, the whole policy that was being discussed with Nixon was Vietnamization. It was supposed to be a process of transferring the bulk of the fighting from the Americans to what was supposed to be this newly stabilizing regime, you know, in the South. And that wasn't going very well. So now it's like Congress is forcing that Vietnamization, no more escalation of the war. And then the question is going to be, you know, as these numbers go down, can the South be able to fight for itself?
The war was slowly turning into what it was always supposed to be, a civil war between Vietnamese to determine the way in which they should be governed.
Yeah.
With the end of the war in sight, morale and discipline among
never
US
really
active
allowed
forces
to
in
be
Vietnam
almost, you know?
was breaking down. No one wanted to risk getting killed just months before they might go home.
Yeah.
Drug use among US forces also reached epidemic proportions, with 10 to 25% of enlisted men using heroin. Many would go back home with addiction problems, with no support from the government that had sent them overseas to fight a pointless war. There was also a dramatic rise in...
It really was tragic, you know, when those soldiers that went home, you know what I mean? These soldiers, right, because there was a draft, right, military draft A lot of them went because you were legally, responsible, legally required to do that. These soldiers, I mean, the things that they've grown up. They grew up seeing the praise that like the World War II veterans, right? Their parents and stuff, like their parents that they got from coming back and hailed as heroes, right? And then taken care of pretty well. Like, a lot of these troops that came back from World War II, they came back and were like, you got cheap homes and you could go to college and do all these things where, and then again, be praised. And then these Vietnam veterans, they came back and there wasn't parades for them, and there wasn't a good infrastructure for them to get the help that they needed, because so much of it, there's going to be horrible mental health issues. And you saw the drug addiction, and they never got hailed as heroes. In fact, in a lot of instances, like I was saying earlier, were called out publicly in the streets because they heard about things like My Lai and just assumed that stuff was rampant everywhere by just across the board from the soldiers involved in that. And they never got that. Those veterans not treated very well.
Fragging, which is when a soldier deliberately tries to kill a fellow soldier or officer, often using a fragmentation grenade.
Wait, what is
Soldiers
this?
to fight a pointless war. There was also a dramatic rise in fragging, which is when a soldier deliberately tries to kill a fellow soldier or officer, often using a fragmentation grenade.
Why?
In June 1971, documents were leaked to the press that showed
get out
that
of
the
the
US had
battle?
been involved in Vietnam all the way back to 1945, much earlier than the public had known. What little public trust there was in the government was shattered, and the
Media's
American
just
people
ripping it
demanded an immediate end to the war. By 1972, there were only 65,000 Americans in Vietnam, and only 5,000 of them were combat soldiers. The ARVN had largely assumed
rest
the
were
responsibility for
trainers and
fighting
stuff.
the war. Nixon was up for re-election, and the North decided to strike once again. On March 30, North Vietnamese troops and tanks crossed the demilitarized zone. The offensive surprised the South Vietnamese defenders, and the North crushed several ARVN divisions. The US Air Force launched a massive bombing campaign and eventually forced the North back with heavy casualties. Just before the US presidential elections, Henry Kissinger negotiated an agreement with the North. There would be a ceasefire, and 60 days later, a full US withdrawal. North Vietnam would return all prisoners of war, and the tripartite commission, composed of 2 US officials, the Viet Cong, and neutral parties, would later convene to determine the nature of the government in the South. The American public was excited, and Nixon won the election by a landslide. Hey, that's bull. That agreement is going to kill my government. You either make these changes or I'm not signing anything. Let's just fight some more then.
It was terrible.
Wanna go back to our original agreement? Yeah. Well, I'm not signing that. Yes, you are. Yes, I am. Finally, on January 27, 1973, the Americans, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the Viet Cong signed the Paris Peace Accords. Within 2 months, the remaining 20,000 American military personnel left the country, and the communists released 600 POWs who returned to their families. But both Vietnams quickly violated the ceasefire. While South Vietnam had now one of the largest and best equipped armed forces in the world, without the Americans, they did not have the capacity to maintain it. But wait, you know what would be a great idea? Breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters. What could possibly
Watergate.
go wrong? Well,
Watergate.
everything. With the Watergate scandal, the White House became paralyzed, and financial aid to South Vietnam decreased even further. The South Vietnam economy, massively dependent on the American military presence, fell into a deep economic crisis with rising unemployment. Morale in the army crumbled, and the ARVN suffered from massive desertions. And now that the Ho Chi Minh Trail was not getting bombed anymore, and also thanks to some aid from their good pals China and the Soviet Union, the North was in a great position. On December 12, 1974, North Vietnam launched a massive offensive. They marched toward the provincial capital of Phuoc Long. The military command abandoned the city and left its defenders to fend for themselves. The garrison made a valiant last stand, but were overrun. The North moved toward Buon Ma Thuot, but the ARVN command was fooled into believing the advance was a diversion and instead reinforced what they believed was the true objective at Pleiku. Buon Ma Thuot fell rapidly, and chaos broke out as terrified refugees fled the advancing North Vietnamese army. The fleeing soldiers and civilians became entangled, and the Viet Cong blew up bridges and felled trees to slow them down. Northern artillery and rockets bombarded the crowd, killing civilians and soldiers alike. The South collapsed with astonishing speed.
Yeah, it
Within
really
just
was. It's like this showed that the Vietnamization thing was never going to work. I mean, what it does show is that, you know, without U.S. involvement, this would have been the outcome back in the 50s, basically as the French left, because the French couldn't do it either. This would have been the outcome of, if this truly was, if this would have been a real just civil war. And what I mean by that is not foreign influence, just North versus South, whatever it is. This would have been this would have been the outcome from the onset.
just a few weeks, the North had surrounded the capital, Saigon. President Thieu resigned and fled the country. Some armed commanders and their troops bravely fought to the end, while many others abandoned their posts and fled. Just before midday on April 30, Northern forces burst through the presidential palace. The Viet Cong flag was hoisted, and South Vietnam ceased to exist. Desperate South Vietnamese rushed to harbors and airfields to try to get out of the country.
This stuff was televised too. Like you saw these images of these people. It was literally the last remaining like helicopters and stuff to get these people there, because these people all figured that, they were supporters, right, of the South and the Americans, that if they were left behind, they would have been, probably killed or something like that. So like literally they're just trying to cram into these helicopters. It was like a life or death thing. I got to get on this or I'm probably going to die. And you saw these images, and this was supposed to be like, seen as like this like grand embarrassment, right, for the Americans, that this is the end and this is what it looks like.
Some managed to get out aboard US naval vessels, but most were left behind. In the end, nothing was accomplished.
A lot of people
Vietnam was unified under North Vietnamese rule exactly as would have happened without US involvement. The war did nothing but lead to the deaths of millions of Vietnamese and tens of thousands of American soldiers who were deceived by their government into believing they were fighting for something meaningful. In the South, many collaborators were executed. Many others were sent to re-education camps to live in horrible conditions. Both South and North Vietnam were left in ruins, and recovery was long and difficult. Tens of millions of gallons of herbicides were unleashed over the country, devastating the local flora and fauna. American chemicals are also responsible for the abnormally high rates of cancers, chromosomal damage, birth defects, and long-lasting neurological disorders that have been detected in sprayed areas. Throughout the war, the US dropped over 7.5 million tons of explosives over Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. This is 3 times more than the amount the Allies dropped both over Europe and Japan in the entirety of World War II. On average, a bomb fell on Laos every 8 minutes for 9 years.
On Laos, the country that wasn't.
Unexploded bombs remain a huge problem in these countries, and there have been at least 50,000 deaths or injuries in the past 50 years.
50,000?
The vast majority of them, civilians, and some as recent as 2022. Henry Kissinger, the mastermind behind the genocide, would later be given a Nobel Peace Prize for his role in ending the war. He recently passed away in his home at the age of 100. The US signed an agreement pledging to grant over $3 billion in aid over 5 years to aid the reconstruction of Vietnam. But they never delivered. Instead, they imposed a complete embargo on trade and assistance to the country, which lasted until 1994.
All right, final thoughts. All right, fantastic little 2-part series here on the Vietnam War. Well researched. A lot of the major events, were in there in a very, oversimplified fashion. But yeah, it does shed a lot of interesting thought about United States and war, right? And like the Cold War in general. This is like a proxy war, right? And showing how the hysteria that was felt in the 50s and 60s towards communism led to the United States getting involved in foreign civil wars, right? And the fear of, remember, domino theory, that was behind this idea that was perpetuated, that, you know, if you let a new country, you know, succumb to communism, that will then, just like a domino stack of dominoes, just keep affecting other countries. And like in this case, they thought it was all, you know, Southeast Asia, and maybe then it would head to like India or something like that. And that was something, again, in a bipartisan way, in the American government and the American, you know, public, and especially early on, was unacceptable. And to go to those lengths of fighting in the name of ending the spread of of communism. And yeah, you see that. So Vietnam War definitely changed a lot of things when it comes to war going forward. One of the legacies is Americans will pretty much not trust their government anymore, or at least be a lot more people will be skeptical of, you know, the things that leads to a country to war, or how a war is actually going. And that just increases more and more with the spread of media. Now you can get instant, on the ground information on Twitter, TikTok, and stuff of events. Then of course it becomes difficult because with such an open access to media and putting media out there, it's also easy to falsify a lot of things. And now we're in this like information overload where so much media and stuff comes out that sometimes it's hard to also decide what is actually true in conflicts like this, and what is propaganda and that kind of thing. And that's there's this war of intelligence for sure going on, and that legacy in a lot of ways kind of started with Vietnam. So anyway, all right, it was fun, great watching this. I'm glad I was able to add a lot of things. I feel like I was able to do that, and thanks to everybody that was recommending this. Like I said in the first video, this video is one of the most recommended of the past couple weeks, maybe three weeks or so, and I kept getting, you know, suggestions for it. So good job. Things I care about with this. I'm excited to see you kind of, like I said, the first video too, kind of plug in the holes, you know, between, you know, oversimplified and kind of use their style and that kind of thing, and keep the great historical content coming. All right, with that, y'all, we'll see you next time. Bye.